Hi again, everybody. Welcome to an all-new edition of No Holden Back. Ben Holden with you. Fred Pletch to my left. Freddie, how you doing today?
Great to have part two.
Yep, part two with George Gwozdecky. And George had a meeting last week when we were taping the first episode. Coach, how you doing today?
I'm doing fine, guys. Nice to see you.
You too. And so offline, we were talking about some of the things we talked about in the first part. I wanted to go back to your Michigan State years a little bit and hit you on a couple things before we kind of dive into your tenure at Denver, the 19 years you spent there. Tom Izzo's a guy covered for 6 years as a reporter in Lansing. Love Tom. We talked about some of that stuff, I think, in the last one. But can you talk to like how you guys met, and your relationship, and some of those things, and what you guys, your friendship now today, if you don't mind?
Well, if I recall correctly, well, first of all, I got to Michigan State in the spring, late spring of '84. And Judd Heathcote was the head coach. He had his staff of full-time assistants. And Tommy was I think it was either a graduate assistant on his staff or a part-time assistant, young guy. And I believe my first year there, he was offered a position, a full-time position at a school like, a school in the South, I don't know, Baylor or one of those programs. And so he left. And then probably, I think I have my years right, but just a couple months later, maybe mid-July, early August, one of Judd's full-time assistants left their staff to go somewhere. And so Judd called Tommy, and Tommy came right back, but now in a full-time position. Well, Tommy was a young guy, single. I was single, a little older than he was. And, so I wouldn't say that we became bosom buddies right away, but as time went on, we started hanging out a little bit more. And then Pat Morris, who was a football coach, I think he was at Minnesota at the time, University of Minnesota, accepted the position on George Perlis's football staff as the offensive line coach. And so I got to know Pat really well because, again, he was single, and the three of us just started to hang out together. And it was for 4 years or so. It was the three amigos, and as we like to stupidly call ourselves, but it was a lot of fun. And certainly the big three sports at Michigan State, football, basketball was starting to hum. Hockey was, as people would say, they wouldn't rebuild, they would reload. And so, it was a great time to be a Spartan, especially on the staff. Doug Weaver was the athletic director, and I learned so many things from so many of the people there, and had a lot of fun with Iz and Pat Morris, the guy we call the King.
Right on. So another issue, or not issue, or I suppose chapter, was when Ron retired. And this is in part from me and from our buddy Neil Koepke. He said that you had 3 times been offered the job, according to him, and didn't take it. So I'm just curious. I mean, it's years past now, and how come that never transpired for you to go back to Michigan State and be the head coach of their hockey program?
You realize, Ben, that question could take up the whole hour here.
Yeah.
I don't mean to put you on the spot. I just wanted to see if you'd share some on it.
I don't feel like I'm being put on the spot, but thank you for your consideration anyway.
Sure.
It was, I think after I left Michigan State and went to Miami and then eventually to Denver, it was always part of my plan in the back of my head. I'd love to go back to Michigan State. 5 of the greatest years of my career, the people I met, the things we were able to accomplish, the fun and the joy, and some of the challenging things that we learned as well, were all part of my time at Michigan State. So yeah, there were rumors over the course of the last couple of years that Ron was going to step aside, and he called me right away when he said, "Hey, I'm planning on stepping aside. I'd love to have you come back and step in for me. And I don't know, that's not verbatim how the conversation went, but and we were playing pretty well. I mean, that year that Ron retired was the first time that our program at Denver in a long time had gotten back to the point where we were one of the top programs in the country.
Right.
But that really wasn't it as much as it was, I was now married and we had a daughter, and my family, we had sunk roots into this city, in this region. And I honestly, I mean, I was very upfront and open with the University of Denver, and they appreciated me doing that, and they came back with a pretty good offer. And but it really, honestly, it really wasn't about the offer as much as my wife and daughter loved Denver, and I loved Denver, and we had a great staff, and not that we couldn't have taken the staff to Michigan State, but it wasn't the right time, I guess is the best way to put it. And so, yeah, probably one of the most difficult things I had to do was tell Ron, thank you, but no. That was really, really hard on me, hard on I struggled with it because I knew it was going to affect our relationship a little bit. And, because he already had everything in place. I mean, he already knew who was going to be, who was going to be his associate ADs, his assistant ADs. And everything was in place. And when I said no, it became a little bit of I don't know, sticking point, but it became a little bit, it ruined his plan, so to speak, at least at that point.
Right. Well, thanks for sharing that. I mean, I've always wanted to know that. I mean, we were running around as, members of the media back then. Well, it's got to be Gwozdecky. It's got to be, and of course we were all wrong. So I'll leave it to the media to be wrong. But,
well, the funny thing is, there's sometimes these crazy things, your stars align, as they say.
Yeah.
And Jeff was leaving Wisconsin, and Barry Richter, who was the AD at Wisconsin, had called me through. He had reached out to me through a friend of his, and saying, "Hey, would you be interested?" So, here I have my alma mater. That when I left Wisconsin to become a young head coach, my dream was to go back to Wisconsin and be a coach and coach the program. Mm-hmm. And now my mentor is leaving Michigan State. He's asked me to come back, and one of the programs I wanted to come back to. And all of a sudden it's like, wow. So, and I decided to stay at DU, which I have no regrets. We had 19 great years, and a lot of fun, a lot of success, and some great people and great relationships I developed through with not only our staff, with our players, but yeah, it was a really, difficult time for me to be able to make the decision, and because I knew that pretty much that would be it. There wouldn't be a second opportunity if I ever decided, hey, I do want to go back to Michigan State. That never probably wasn't going to resurface again.
Thanks for sharing, George. Freddie.
Well, let's revisit the first year in Denver, George, 1994, 95. First of all, how'd you get there? How did you know Denver was the right move at that time? Denver, I guess, when they had it going back in the day, they used a lot of Canadian players, I guess. They were really one of the first, Denver and Michigan. How did the Denver situation come about?
I've been always really, I've never planned my coaching career. I've been fortunate to be able to, wherever I landed, I really dug into it and really, really enjoyed it, truly enjoyed it, surrounded by some great people, whether that was at River Falls or at Michigan State or Miami. And, you know, by the time Jack McDonald, the AD at Denver, had made his decision to bring in a new coach, we had just finished our 5th year at Miami, and we were finally competitive. You know, we had, the previous year we'd gone to the NCAA tournament, lost to Wisconsin. We were not only on the ice, but from a recruiting standpoint, Danny Boyle, who went on to play for many years in the National Hockey League and was one of our recruits coming in. That's during that our 5th year at Miami, he had committed, signed on the dotted line, and he was one of a group of really good, talented players coming to Miami. So we had no interest, no plans on leaving, none whatsoever. And so I remember when Jack called me, I said, "Thank you very much, and I appreciate it, but thank you. We're not that interested. This is where, I mean, we love this community and we love the program, and we've got a lot of great support, and I love the CCHA, and so and then Dan Ritchie, the chancellor of the university, who really built the university, called me, and I remember him saying, "Just come out here for a vacation for your family, 3-day vacation, you know." And I said, "Well, if they're foolish enough to throw their money out, why not?" I mean, so we came out to Denver. It's about this time of year, and we came out, and it was a beautiful blue sky like Colorado has, warm, sunny, and they toured us around, and the campus was, how do I say this, especially on the athletics. Well, the campus was not very impressive. Let me put it that way. The physical look of the campus was not very impressive, and it was old, and it was run down, and you could tell it wasn't really taken care of very well. And so there was, it was like, okay, and the old building, the old barn, what they call the old D Arena, was an old World War II airplane hangar. I mean, it was just, there was nothing that at that point that said, "Hey, you got to come to Denver." And then the last thing I did after, on my tour, was to meet with Dan Ritchie, the chancellor of the university, and that's what turned it around for me. He explained to me his vision and what he planned on doing for the university, what he wanted to have happen for athletics, and he showed me the miniature scale model that he had in his little library off of his office. And included what became the Ritchie Center, and he said, "I'm putting my money where my mouth is. Next week we start our capital campaign. I'm writing a check for 18 million, and it'll probably get more." So there was. I remember getting on the plane in Denver out of the old Stapleton Airport to fly back to Cincinnati with my wife. My wife and daughter came with me. And we're sitting on the runway ready to take off, and my wife says, "Well, what do you think?" I said, "Well, I don't know. They've offered me the job, and it's kind of cool, but what do you think?" And she says, "Well, we're coming." And I said, "Really?" She said, she loved the climate. She loved some of the areas that we had toured around, the neighborhoods around DU, although we never settled in those areas. She just obviously the climate, by that time of the year, it's starting to get hot and humid in the Midwest, and in the West, and in Colorado, it's very dry. So it made it easier for the decision for me. Probably the hardest thing for me to do, one of the hardest things I've ever had to do, was to explain to our team that I had made the decision to leave Miami and go to Denver, and but have never regretted it. Really, it was first couple of years were challenging, but certainly good things developed.
So 3 days becomes 19 years. And,
Yeah, yeah.
I did a little research. First 5 games, 1-4, you give up 24 goals. But one of the things your predecessor, the guy I call the funniest man in hockey, Frank Serratori, he had gone out, or his recruiters had gone out, and got a bunch of players from Scandinavia. Antti Laaksonen played in the NHL. I'm going down the list here. Eric Anderson, Petri Ginther, Anders Bjork, and the goalie Sinue Wallenheimo, who I'm told is a story all by himself. And it winds up, you're back in the NCAA tourney in your first year, and had to be a pretty good finish, but it was the Scandinavian players who played a pretty good role, along with Angelo Ricci, who we all know from the Colorado Thunderbirds, and a Denver-based skills coach who led your team in scoring. So talk about that first team.
Well, you know what? That team, the team that I inherited was a pretty darn good team. The unfortunate for Frank and his staff in their last year, there was a number of injuries, including some of their better players, Paul Cook and Jason Elders, guys who were really good players who were injured, and for whatever reason, it was not the kind of year that I think a lot of people expected. I know Dan Ritchie was always very involved in decision making, even though Jack McDonald was the AD. Dan Ritchie was the guy who was always peering over his shoulder, and because I experienced that as well. But I remember telling anybody who would listen is that the cupboard is not bare here. We've got some really good players. You've mentioned some of them. We good goaltending, Jimmy Mullen and Sinue Wallenheimo. We were, the WCHA was a good league, but we were good. I wouldn't say that it was an outstanding job of coaching, because those guys were good players. We made the NCAA tournament that first year. I started to get a better handle on how, especially the Scandinavian players who were all real good, how they wanted to play and how we needed them to play. So there's at times a little bit of push and shove, push back. Sometimes they did. Antti Laaksonen was a dynamic player. Sinue Wallenheimo was a interesting athlete, a guy who was as you would call him, a hot dog. I mean, he loved the attention. In goal, he would do the craziest things that you are frowned on as an athlete. Maybe especially back in those days. Maybe not so much nowadays, but in a game, he would somebody shoot the puck on him, he'd make the save, and then he would toss it back to the referee, and then hold his stick up like a gun and shoot the kid, or toss it back at the kid and say, try, not good enough, try better next time. I remember we were in the WCHA Final Five, either his sophomore or junior year, and it was being played at the where the Minnesota Timberwolves play, the Target Center.
Target Center, yeah.
Yeah, and they had these plastic advertising things on the boards, and one of them was throughout the game was coming loose and always falling, not completely tearing off the boards, but always falling, and the referees had to continue to blow the whistle, stop the game, and go over and kind of paste it back up against the wall. And at what point the plays at the other end of the ice were playing Minnesota, and the plays in Minnesota zone, and all of a sudden this banner, is falling off the wall. So Minnesota gets it, and they start coming out of their zone, whistles blown because there's no real attack going on. And Wallenheimo goes racing out of his crease out to the boards, and using his hips and his butt, he kind of wiggles and squeezes the whole banner back onto the boards, and people are just dying. I mean, because he's just, rather than just using his hands, he's going to use his butt. So I mean, and he knew that he knew he'd get a reaction, and whether it was cheering or booing or what have you, when he was in net, I would, when we were during the series back in those days, everybody played home and away, a 2-game series, and when the series that Denver would come to Minnesota, people would want to know what game, and the media would want to know what game Wallenheimer was playing. Was it going to be the Friday game, the Saturday game, or both? Because as soon as they knew what game Wallenheimer was playing, the place, 10,500, there would be in their seats for warm-up, because Wallenheimer he could care less whether he took a shot or not. He would jump on, he reminded me of Robbie Moore back at Michigan, the old goaltender at Michigan. He would jump on up onto the crossbar and sit there and screw his legs and wave, and people would, chant would go Wallenheimer, Wallenheimer, and he would lead the orchestra, and it was, and I would be in the locker room kind of making my final notes before we get going. And I remember our sports information director came rushing into the locker room, and I said, "You okay?" And he says, "You got to come out and see what's going on." So I come out to the bench, and there's 10,000 people screaming at Wallenheimer, and he's pretending he's making a save. I mean, but it's almost like he's on stage by himself, leading the cheers, and it was, I've never seen anything like it, and I don't think I'll ever see anything like it, because he was unique. I don't know. I think there were times where his teammates probably didn't like it, because it maybe got them a little upset, or it got the other team jazzed up when they didn't need to be jazzed up. But we were good enough, and he was good enough. He could back it up. And so for the most part, it was a lot of fun. I never thought that I would, as a young coach, that I would have a player like that I would allow to do some of the antics that he did. But it was all in good fun. I don't think he ever went across the line. But he was an interesting cat. He played in a rock band in the summers when he went back to Finland. He's a very successful member of parliament in Finland now. But those days, a lot of funny, interesting memories of Sinuhe.
Awesome stuff, George. So as we kind of progress through 01-02, you win 32. That's fair to say the breakout season for your team to that point. What do you credit what went into the build to get your program to that level? And 2 years later, you get your first national title, which we'll get to. But talk about that process of getting to that point to becoming a real power in the sport and putting Denver back in that position again.
Well, before I get there, I do want to mention one thing. It's those guys, those Scandinavian players who we inherited that first year. The guy who did all the recruiting of those guys was a guy by the name of Mike Gibbons. And Mike just retired from St. Cloud just about a month and a half ago.
Where hasn't he coached, George?
Oh, yeah. And Mike was a great guy and did a great job of recruiting those guys. I know Frank helped, but, Gibby was the guy that, the challenge we had was that by the time we arrived in Denver that early summer, prior to the start of our first year at DU, the one mistake, if you will, is that a really good recruiting class that was in place at Denver was not signed. None of them were signed. Now, guys so when Frank and his staff were released, it was before the national signing period. And so as soon as Frank and his staff were released, the vultures descended on those kids. And every single one of them, I think there was 5 or 6 of them who were really good players, who we would have to face against in the WCHA at other schools. decided to go elsewhere. And so, when we got in, I guess it was probably June at some point, late June, that we finally arrived. And the top players for the fall for the recruiting class are already all gone. And, I knew down the road, 3 or 4 years down the road, that would really hurt us. And it did. We did bring in one player that year who was we'd never seen him play, a guy by the name of Mike Darren out of the BC League. But that was our only recruit that year. And so, fast forward, we there was a struggle for us to be able to recruit well. When we were starting to, the pipeline to the Scandinavian countries was starting to dry up, because those towns where those kids are coming from didn't want to lose them to American colleges. So they were offering them bigger contracts, school paid contracts. And so, we started to realize, okay, as great a recruiting factor that Frank and Gibby had done, it was becoming more and more difficult. So we had to come back and try our best in the U.S. and Canada. And especially, I think it was 98 or 99, the old building, the old D Arena was taken down. And there were some really tough years. We lost our entire student body because we couldn't play on campus. We had 5 different venues we played at throughout those 2 seasons. Now we had a small practice facility, but on campus, but there was no place to play. So so we didn't have our choice of playing on Fridays and Saturdays anywhere. Usually a weekend series would be Thursday night at McNichols, Sunday afternoon at the Air Force Academy, or a Saturday night at the Denver Coliseum, and a Monday afternoon at McNichols Ice Arena, or a home series at the Colorado Springs World Arena against Minnesota. I mean, it was really tough. And our new facility finally opened, I think, in 2000 or 2001. And that's when all of a sudden you start to see certain things, at least the recruiting, the playing field for recruiting was starting to get balanced out, because at least we had a new facility that could keep us in competition with some of the schools in our league.
Yeah. I know Fred's got something he wanted to hit you on in that time frame you were just mentioning, Freddie.
I believe, Fred, that one year, I think you said 30 or 31 wins. We have talked about it already, because that was the year that I think Ron Mason retired at Michigan State, if my timeline's right.
102. Yeah, that was. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
Yep.
And so, all of a sudden, we'd kind of built that thing. We're sitting pretty good. And so, we were, all our effort and toil and some tears and not much blood, but a lot of tears and effort and energy went into building that thing, and a lot of emotion. So yeah, we were finally starting to see after 6 seasons or so, we were finally starting to see the fruit of our labor, and it felt good. And certainly Steve Miller and Seth Appert, who were big parts of that. I mean, huge parts of building the program from a recruiting standpoint, from a teaching standpoint. They were critical to our success in our building.
Yeah, funny you bring up Killer's name, Steve Miller, longtime assistant coach, a guy who I really didn't get to know real well until he came to the Big Ten, but just a guy who has had success, or his teams have had success, and the recruiters, the assistant coaches are the unsung heroes, I guess, of a program. He got you so many great players that Ben will ask you about. After Denver, went to Providence. They won a national championship. Ohio State's had success. how did you get to know Steve and realize that he's a man that could be a real key component of a college hockey program or any hockey program, I guess?
Killer went to school at St. Mary's, a Division III, NCAA Division III program in Minnesota, small private school. After he graduated, he'd been a one-year assistant with Don Olson at St. Mary's. And then Don reached out to me and said, hey, you know, I've got a young guy here, Steve Miller, who wants to go into coaching. He's played for me for 4 years, on and off between JV and varsity. And he's been an assistant coach for me for 1 year as kind of a student assistant. Would you be interested? Well, yeah. I mean, you know, we have Miami back in those days had a really success. In fact, I still think they do has a very good relationship between athletics and the physical education department. Physical education offers graduate assistantships for teaching in the physical education school. And then if there's any time those guys have an opportunity, male and female graduate assistants, to volunteer their time to the sport of their choice. So Steve applied or sent me a letter, applied to the physical education school, the graduate program, and was accepted. And I knew nothing of him other than he had tried to get into River Falls when I was there, and I turned him down. And he still, to this day, never lets me hear the end of that. But you know, I didn't know Steve, and he didn't know me. And he came in and, like all of us as young coaches, learned, worked hard. You could see he was passionate for the game. Did a lot of great things. Also learned from mistakes. But you could see that as things evolved for him, not only through his 1 or 2 years as a graduate assistant, but as a restricted earnings coach at the time, back in those days, you know, there was no question that, you know, when we left Miami to come to Denver, I wanted him to come with us. And you know, I was very glad when he decided to come along with us. I mean, again, he was smart, passionate, driven, intense, and some of those things at times would get him in trouble. But it's one of the reasons why he had the nickname Killer from a young kid. We didn't give him the name. He had the name Killer from his neighborhood when he was a kid, when he was always the smallest of the group of kids that hung around and played street hockey and played football and played basketball. But, you know, in order to be able to try to compete with the older, bigger guys, you know, he'd always be, his nose would always be bleeding and his glasses would be knocked off, but he was coming back for more. So, you know, that was kind of his MO as a young coach. But then certainly, as we all learn, I mean, it's sometimes you can sit back and there's different ways to attack things and do things. And but, you know, just like all of us, he evolved and became an outstanding evaluator of talent, a really good recruiter, a really good coach. He was he was a sponge, and then obviously a few years after we arrived at Denver, and Steve was in a full-time position with us. Seth Appert, in fact, I think it was when Rico left our position, our staff at Denver to take the Miami job. Seth Appert, who was a volunteer assistant for us and had just accepted a full-time position at Mercyhurst with Rick Godkin. Rico gets the job at Miami, and Seth had just arrived. He was just unloading his stuff into his home at Mercyhurst, and I called and said, "Hey, you got to come back here. We got a full-time job for you." And so he just turned his U-Haul around and came right back to Denver. rest is history. So those two guys worked great together, very different, but still great friends. And they were the constructors of the program. They were they were the guys that brought in not only great players, but were critical in our move to the top of the pile back in those in that first decade of the millennial.
You know, I was sitting here thinking about a couple of things you said earlier, George, and I've gotten to know Bill Tierney. I know you know Bill, and you guys shared, you know, the Ritchie Center there. You mentioned that earlier, and the offices are right there. And he went out there and got that job kind of the similar way you did. They wanted him to consult, and he's like, went home and he's like, why don't I take this? So that just kind of popped into my head there when I was listening to you there about that. But so you get into the 02-03 season. You guys get knocked out in the first round of the conference tournament, and then you come back the next year in 03-04, and you guys end up winning the whole thing. But let's kind of talk a little bit about that season. What did you see? What do you remember about that team that you felt they had a shot or they were a special and unique team that year?
Well, that team was had great character and a lot of characters. There's nowhere better way to say it, I think. I mean, and that team struggled like crazy. I mean, I remember I think it was early January. We were buried in 8th place, I think, in our 10-team conference and going nowhere. And I remember Steve and Seth sitting in my office, and we're trying to figure out, and it was their idea that they were convinced that we had to change a few things and how we prepared, how we conducted practice. You know, I was a victim of the things I always would do. This is what we do practice on Mondays. This is what we do on Tuesdays, because I had learned from Ron, and it was, you know, there was in the practices that I ran at Denver, there wasn't a lot of variety between Mondays. And, you know, you could pretty much knew what was going to happen on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays. And so, I mean, it was before the American development model, before the ADM became popular with cross-ice games and things like that. This was when Steve and Seth really impressed upon me, hey, we've got to get our guys to compete harder in practice so it becomes more natural in games, to have more fun in practice so they want to compete. And I remember sitting there for probably 4, 5, 6 days of really intense staff meetings discussing this, because this was something really revolutionary for me. And I was pushing back hard. But, you know, at the same point, I'm thinking to myself, we're in 8th place. I mean, there's not much farther we can get down, but we certainly can move. And so I remember saying, okay, this is, you know, let's try it. And, you know, our practice plans were so foreign to what I was used to. But I said, okay, guys, let's give it a shot. In the back of my mind thinking, okay, if this doesn't work out, we're going to throw it right into the garbage can and go right back to what I believe in. And almost from day one, it was so new to our guys, and they had fun, they competed. And, you know, by the end of the season, we had climbed out of that hole we put ourselves in. I believe we got knocked out, in the first round of the WCHA playoffs, but it was of great value to us because we were so injured by that point. It allowed many of our guys to get healthy over the off weekend. We knew we were going to be in the national tournament, but still we were kind of a dark horse. But you know, it was a magical run once we started our play in the Western region down at the Colorado Springs, and knocked off Miami, Rico's team, in a close game, and then upset North Dakota in a, you know, Dean had a great team. We beat them 1-0. And then, you know, obviously the Frozen Four is, you know, coming back on Duluth in the semifinal game, and, you know, down 3-1 or 3-2, I forget, going into the third period, and coming back and beating them. And then some of the issues that we were presented with before the championship game, and then get into the championship game, and it's a close game, and it's 1-0 for us with 90 seconds to go. We got two guys in the penalty box on a 5-on-3. They pull their goaltender. For the last 89 seconds, it's a 6-on-3, and we withstand the barrage or overcome the barrage or hang in there, whatever you call it. But I mean, it was, yeah. I remember being so caught up in the focusing on what was going on in that last minute and a half. And then probably, I don't know, about a month later, watching the game back and becoming really emotional at that point, because there were so many things that I was not even privy to that were happening in the Garden. I think it was called the Boston Garden back then. But anyway, things that I wasn't aware of that, but, you know, obviously your first time at accomplishing, you know, and having that kind of success will always be riveted in my mind, and you know, the joy that so many of not only our players, but our administration and the school and, you know, the chancellor and you know, the Boston. I remember the bus ride from the Boston Garden back to the hotel. It's probably about a 15-minute ride, and the amount of we had police, what do you call them? Police escort.
Yeah.
And I mean, the lights that were going on in front of us. And I mean, it was really, it felt like you were, you know, the president or the Pope or the Beatles, you know. So I mean, it was yeah, the great memories from not only Boston, but coming back afterwards, back in Denver. Truly a memorable time in my coaching career. But some of those guys, Ryan Caldwell on that team, and Max Bull, and, you know, Adam Burkholz, and Matty Carl was a freshman. You know, that just, you know, so many guys who played such crucial roles in that team's success, and obviously Steve and Seth as well.
Yeah. Well, you were touching on the January. You were swept at home by Duluth in early January. Of course, you get them back in the.
We're going to go back over that again, huh? Can't we just keep moving forward?
And then Colorado College swept you in the WCHA playoffs. So, and then there's a similar path when we get to the next year to talk about that. But I'll let Freddie fire away here. Freddie.
Well, you're doing all that winning, George, and I'm working for Tom Anastas at the CCHA. And how can we compete? How can we stay abreast of the WCHA? You've got my first 2 years, Minnesota goes back to back.
Yep.
Then 2005, one of our campuses, Ohio State, hosts the Frozen Four.
Right,
and
yeah.
that's the year. It's 4 WCHA teams in it. So before we talk about your team's success, why was the WCHA just so dominant in the early aughts, I guess?
Well, you know, first of all, almost every single school, the majority of schools in the WCHA at that time, not all of them, but majority of them had hockey on their campus for decades, whether it was DU, Colorado College, Minnesota, Wisconsin, North Dakota, Duluth. And hockey was important to those schools. Hockey was important to those campuses. Hockey was funded well, you know, from a recruiting standpoint, from a facility standpoint. When it was a Friday or Saturday home series, you know, you would have these buildings sold out, and you know, it was important that these programs were successful. So, you know, I think it was partially certainly driven by administration that we're going to give our program, our men's hockey program, as much help as we possibly can to be able to be competitive in what we consider the top league in the country. Now, certainly, you know, you had schools, the newcomers to the league. There was Alaska Anchorage and Minnesota State Mankato, well, I forgot, Michigan Tech was a long time program as well. So, at St. Cloud was new to, to Division One in those days. So, again, the majority of schools were long time hockey programs, so had been part of the WCHA for many, many years. And so I think that was part of it. I think you had an era where you had a lot of really good coaches. I mean, Donnie Lucia, Scotty Sandlin, Dean Blaze, Scotty Owens, Jeff Sauer. I mean, guys who'd cut their teeth on and had a lot of success in the league. And I think that I don't know if TV was driving force as much, but if talented hockey players wanted to play in good leagues, wanted to play in front of big crowds, wanted to have the opportunity to be able to move on to play, professional hockey, the WCHA offered that, and the CCHA, as much as Ron Mason and Red Berenson did to help develop that league, especially Ron, they were the newer league, and a lot of young programs, comparatively speaking, whether it was Lake Superior or Miami or even Bowling Green for that matter. So, I loved my years in the CCHA, but there's no question that the WCHA just had a head start just because of the length of time that majority of those schools have been competing in hockey and at the national level, and how many NHL players they had put into professional ranks. So there was a lot of things going for them, including a pretty good TV package for a lot of those back in the old prime ticket days. And so, yeah, there was, I think, there's certain cycles that everybody goes through, and in that 05, 04, 05, 06 years, WCHA, we had some pretty darn good teams that we were in a cycle of being really dominant as a league. And so I think that's one of the reasons why you probably saw the 4 teams in the Frozen Four.
Yeah, and that was a year to show how good your team was. Regular season champs, playoff champs in WCHA, and national champs. And I know Ben's got some questions, but aside from Peter Menino's great goaltending at the Frozen Four, something I'll always remember, your reaction, semifinal against Colorado College, maybe third period, one of your players, I forget who it was, had a breakaway. And reminded me, we talked about how Sinue, the goalie, back in '95 was a hot dog.
Yeah.
Breakaway, I forget who it was, and I think he went between the legs, something that they do all the time now on shootouts, scores. So here's a kid, scores a goal in the Frozen Four. He goes back to the bench, and he gets an earful for about 30 seconds from George.
Ryan Dingle.
Right.
It was Ryan Dingle. I believe Ryan was a freshman, and he came in, he tried to do the little a semi-lacrosse move, try to flip the puck up on his stick, and we were in pretty good control of the game, but I was not happy because, again, I feel like a little bit of a hypocrite because we had, you allow Sinue Wallenheimo to do the things he was doing, but I felt it showed a great deal of lack of respect to our team, or to our opponent at that point, because we had him, I think the score was 5-2 or 6-2 at the time.
6-2-5.
Yep.
And so yeah, I lit Ryan up pretty good on the bench. I think back in, what we've talked about and what we allowed, or what I allowed Wallenheimo to do, and yet I don't allow the same thing for Dingle to do. Ryan's reminded me of that on occasion when we see each other on the golf course, but he became Ryan was a crucial part of our team, especially when we teamed him up with Stasny. That was a interesting Frozen Four. I mean, in fact, the second half of that season from January on, it sounds, I don't mean to make it sound like it was that easy, but we really rolled the table. We played very well and close games. But I remember probably the most challenging games were in the regionals for us. We had to go to UMass and play Bemidji in the semifinal of that region, and then New Hampshire in the championship game of that region. And I remember to me that was more emotional and more difficult. And I mean, I was drenched in my own sweat after that New Hampshire game because it was close, it was tight. They were a really good team, and knowing full well that, I mean, we had an even bigger hurdle to overcome at the Frozen Four, but to get to the Frozen Four was as difficult for us as it had been the previous year.
I'm curious, George, the story on Peter Menino. He's a guy that's from our neck of the woods, Farmington Hills, I believe, if my memory serves me right. What's the story on how you got him to Denver?
That was Seth Appert. Peter was kind of similar to Adam Burkle. Neither one of Seth Appert's talents is his ability to evaluate players and goaltenders. And he spotted Adam when Adam really wasn't being recruited by anybody. He spotted Peter, and both guys were kind of journeyman goaltenders. Had kind of moved from one team to another throughout their teenage careers, playing here and then not really getting the respect they deserve or the playing time they deserve. And the following year, they have to move on to another place because they're not wanted, and kind of the misfits, if you will. But Seth spotted talent in both of them, spotted drive in both of them, a great work ethic, tremendous character. And I remember Peter telling the story that he watched Adam Burkle lead us to that Frozen Four championship in Boston, and telling himself and his family and us, that's what he wants to be in Adam's take Adam's spot, because Adam was graduating. Peter wants to lead the team and put the team in that same position the following year. Well, that's exactly what he did. Now, obviously, he didn't play all of our games. We had, Glenn Fisher, who did a great job that year. But once we got to the Frozen Four, it was Peter's net, and kind of interesting to see how that Frozen Four was completed with Peter kind of speculating and predicting and wanting and dreaming of it, and all of a sudden coming off the ice with his dream fulfilled.
So as great as you guys were that year, Fred mentioned it, 9 losses, a series with Nodak. You lose both games, you get them in the tournament, and then the national championship game. What do you still think about when you hear that and you think of that second straight national title, George?
I don't think as much about the second national title as I think about that back in those years when North Dakota really became, other than maybe, it became without a doubt our biggest rival. And many people would say in North Dakota, they would say the biggest rival they have is Denver. It became a rivalry because out of nastiness, out of ugliness. There were a couple incidences, where you may recall a hit that one of our kids put on one of their kids and broke his neck. That was certainly a horrible thing to go through. But the both teams, both programs were long time rivals, but it got so heated in those days. Whether the series was in Denver or in North Dakota or in the regionals, it was without a doubt. People say, well, Minnesota is Denver's biggest rival, or Colorado College is Denver's biggest rival. Well, in those days, there's no question the biggest rival for DU and maybe the biggest rival in the league was DU North Dakota. Legendary games. Maybe I don't want to be too dramatic when I say hatred, but boy, oh boy, when the games are going on, it sure felt that way. I mean, you wanted to, when you were, they were always really physical, intense, emotional. Back in those days, I think maybe North Dakota was the only program, the WCHA, that still sponsored their Friday noon luncheons, where the opposing coach would come and talk. The head coach, North Dakota's coach, would talk, and the convention center, wherever they held the luncheon, was jammed. I mean, absolutely jammed. And it was for the. I remember Dean Blaze telling me nobody attracts the crowds at our luncheons as much as when DU comes to town. And we're talking hundreds of people. And so, it was just, and to be able to play them on the national stage with, some of the great teams they had. Yeah, it was very, very memorable a time period for me.
Well, one of the, new Motown acts for me, a guy by the name of Mayor Hawthorne, does just a great song called The Walk. It's not about you.
Gee, okay. Okay, thank you. Okay.
Not about you, but it could be. Today. We all know what prompted it, a non-call, but when you think back now, and I'm sure you've thought back on it, and I'm sure people have asked you many times, Woz, what were you thinking?
Well, Schloss told us you sat down with him and did a story about it recently, right? Brad Schlossman?
Yeah, a couple seasons ago, Brad, who's the writer for does a great job of covering Fighting Sioux.
Yep.
That's not their name anymore, but that's
They'll always be that.
Yeah. So, I'm trying to remember what year it was. I think it was the
2009, I think.
Okay.
2000.
Not that it matters. But it was again, it was like a lot of times you feel like you're being, let me back up and say this. Playing in many of these venues in the old WCHA were difficult for the opposing team, difficult for the officials. Probably no more difficult venue in the old WCHA than at Engelstad Arena in North Dakota. 11,000 plus, and it's packed, and they are, it can be intimidating, a place to play, as I said, for the opposing team and for the opposing officials. And I just, I remember feeling that we were getting the kind of the short end of the stick in that game. Needing to do something and maybe being a little bit too vocal, but also feeling like, okay, this is nothing new. I mean, this is how many coaches handle trying to get the referee's attention. And I remember the official in the game, there's a stoppage of play, and he calls our captain over, and he calls him over the plays. He calls him over on the other side of the ice surface, away from our bench. And our captain kind of is talking to him for, 5 or 10 seconds. And then he turns around, JP Testweed, our captain, skates to our bench and said, Coach, he just tossed you out of the game. And I was like, really? I thought he was messing with me for a few seconds, and I realized he was serious. And I was more, okay, I'm out of the game. I'm not happy with the way the game has been officiated so far. I think North Dakota is getting the majority of the calls either no calls or calls, and something needs to be said. And the official would not come within 100 feet, well, 85 feet, I guess, of our bench. He refused to come and talk to me. And so if he's not going to come to talk to me, I'm going to go talk to him. And that was it. I never had a chance to talk to him because I tried to intercept him, but he skated away. And that's when I had a little conversation with the linesman. But that was about it.
But, correct me if I'm wrong, but you were able to walk with confidence because a good Northern Ontario lad had galoshes on. So you knew the grip was good, right? Galoshes.
Yeah. Fortunately, the ice was it was about, I think it was about halfway through the second period.
Good grip.
So you had a pretty good grip. The galoshes that I always wore because I had leather bottoms on most of my dress shoes, and the bench gets really wet with water, and so early in my years I'd be ruining a lot of my dress shoes just because they would get sopping wet. So I started using galoshes, and not only did they preserved my dress shoes, but allowed me a little bit better grip on the ice.
Since we're on clothing, I have to ask this one too. I'm going to go back to Ron. And I remember the first time I went to practice and he's wearing the leather gloves. Did you at any point, before that, were you wearing hockey gloves, or did you do that after you coached with Ron?
Oh, after I coached with Ron. Yeah, that was, to me, that was genius.
What changed? Why is that?
First of all, you kept my hands warmer.
Okay.
And secondly, I could, when you had hockey gloves on, if you wanted to use a marker on a board, you always had to take one glove, take it off, put it underneath your armpit, and then with your free hand. Well, with the gloves that that Ron wore, that I would eventually do this as well. You didn't have to take off a glove. You just had the marker and you could do it. So and plus I wanted to be like Ron. I mean, I never got the Corvette that Ron had, but I figured that if with the kind of success and the kind of coach he's been, hey, if it works for him, I'm going to try it. And so it kept my hands warm because there's which was a good thing because my hands were always kind of cold. But the only time since I left Ron, I never wore those garden gloves, as people call them, is my 2-year coffee break with Tampa. I didn't dare wear anything but just regular hockey gloves, just like the rest of the staff.
Yeah, you led me right there, and you finished before the split. Everything happened, the WCHA, the Big Ten, all that. Steven Stamkos to me is one of the greatest goal scorers I've ever seen. I'm 49. Having a chance to coach him and coach at that level, what was that whole experience like? What do you still remember about the couple of years you spent there in Tampa, George?
It was awesome. I loved it. I still stay in touch with a lot of guys on the staff. Some of the players, whenever they have success, I'll send them a little note or whatever. And so we still stay in touch. But I missed the college game. I really did. When my contract was fulfilled, Steve Yzerman and I had a good conversation, and John and I had a good conversation, and I wanted to get back. I wanted to get back in the college game, and I wasn't sure if I was still at an age level where I could get back to the college game, but I thoroughly enjoyed there's no bigger thrill than coaching elite players, and coaching in the National Hockey League, and especially during the playoffs. That first year we got knocked out in the first round by Montreal, and learned a ton about the difference between. I learned a ton on the team and John and our players. Everybody learned a great deal about what we needed to do the second year, and obviously the second year we go right to the finals and lose in Game 6 in Chicago. So I'm still convinced that if Tyler Johnson doesn't break his wrist in that first game, in a very little open ice hit, breaks his wrist in Game 1 in Tampa, and then at that point he still's in the line, but he can't move. His wrist is frozen, and he was such a dynamic player for us that year that I will go to my grave saying that if Tyler Johnson doesn't break his wrist, we probably win in 5. But that's me. I'm sure Chicago fans in Chicago would have something else to say about that. But anyway, it was a great experience. I loved every minute of it. A lot more video than I was ever used to working with when I was at the college level. But it's strictly coaching. At the collegiate level, you wear 4 or 5 hats. At the NHL level, as an assistant coach, all you do is coaching. Whether it's you're on the ice or in your office watching video and meeting with the player, but that's all you do. So yeah, it was. But I thoroughly enjoyed it. It was a great experience. I learned a lot. Had some really good people. Rick Bowness, who's now the interim coach at Dallas, had been coaching for forever in the National Hockey League. Great man, great coach. Franz Jean and Nigel Kerwin and Stevie Stumpy Thomas. Some really good people that I met with and got to be friends with. And as I said before, great experience.
So, George, your hands basically are still all over the Denver hockey program. You had Matt Carl, went on to play over 700 NHL games on the back-to-back national championship teams. And now David Carl, one of the bright young minds in the game, is the head coach. So can you walk us through what happened with David? He's coming out of Shattuck St. Mary's. You and your staff commit to him with a scholarship, and he has health issues, and you honor it, because let's face it, if for whatever reason, hey, sorry kid, we're going in a different direction, could really change the face of what's happening now. So tell us the David Carl saga.
Have we talked about that at all?
No,
No,
we haven't. No.
The reason I ask is because there have been a couple of interviews I've done recently that we've talked about that as well. So, we had a great relationship, obviously, with the Carl family because of Matt and the success Matt had for us, and the success that Matt was part of, that that he brought to the table for DU. It was always interesting to watch David and Matt skate. They're so similar. I mean, it was a little bit spooky to watch how their movements and how they seem to be so similar. Now, different players, but I still tease David because David was convinced St. Cloud was a better place for him to go to play hockey. And so I remember close, it was, I don't know, maybe February, and I flew down to Faribault he was at Shattuck at the time, and to have a dinner with him and talk to him about it and convince them that, hey, we know we're not trying to bring in Matt Carl, we're trying to bring in David Carl. So don't worry about trying to fill your brother's footsteps. You're going to play a different role. And so, I think David was excited about that idea and decided to come to DU. And he knew DU very well. And then obviously, he goes to the combine, NHL combine, because he is scheduled to be a mid to early second round pick, maybe sneak into the first round. At the combine, at one of his health tests, if that's the way to put it, they discovered not a heart murmur, but an issue with the heart. They said, you know what, you better get this checked out because this doesn't look real good. And so I remember Bob, Carl, David and Matt's dad calling me and saying, hey, we're going to go to Rochester in a week from now and the Mayo Clinic and going to have David checked out. We don't think it's really bad, but the doctors, want to have it checked out anyway. And so obviously a week later, Bob calls and says, hey, George, we just had a conference, what's the word? Consultation? No, consultation
Yeah.
with one of the doctors, and David's career is over because of his heart ailment that he has. And he says, I can't talk right now. It's pretty emotional, but I'll call you back. And so during the time period that we were off the phone, for some reason I recall it must have been a Friday or maybe a Thursday, because I was in the office, and I remember telling the news to Steve and Seth, and then was it Seth? Anyway, going down to our administration's office and saying, look, this is what I'd like to do. This is what's just happened. I just learned of this, but and I remember our administrator saying, are you sure, George? Yeah, I know this is kind of you're going through an emotional moment here. Is this what you want to do? You're probably going to have to give up a scholarship. You only have to be, I said, yeah, it's the right thing to do. So when Bob Carl called me back, I was able to give him the news that, hey, Bob, I know this is a tough time. Please let David know that we still want him here, that we're going to honor his scholarship. We'll find a role for him within our program as a student coach or what have you. But the Carl family means too much to DU to let him go. And so yeah, that's how it all went. And I eventually later that afternoon spoke with David, who was still. David's always been quiet. He was even more quiet, pretty shooken up by the whole thing, but by the decision he had to retire. But I certainly he was really happy that he knew he still had a home, and he knew where he was going to be coming to, in the fall. So that's how it all unfolded.
Yeah, I've had it a couple times. I've obviously got to know him pretty good over the years, George, doing the league, and we did a story on that a couple years ago. And to hear him talk, he's forever grateful. I can tell you that. I'm sure you know that. I'm sure you've talked, and I always enjoy talking with him, man. He's a fun guy to talk to, and he's done a great job in the couple of years he's taken over there. So one thing, you were with Tampa those 2 years, like we were talking before that segment there about David. You didn't stay away long, because from there you end up coaching. We talked about this off the top of part one. You win in the championship, your program last year. How did it all take place for you to end up going from Tampa Bay, and now you're the head coach of Valor Christian out there in Colorado?
We were in the first round of the playoffs going into the first round of the playoffs against Detroit. Okay. And Killer Miller had just, I think their season had just completed. He was in his first and only year with Providence, and they had just won the national title. But Steve's family, he had, they were left behind in Denver.
Right.
And so Steve had made his decision after they won the national title at Providence. He says, I don't want to go through another year where I have to be away from my family and my wife for this long period of time. I'm coming back to Denver. Don't know what I'm going to do. Well, someone from Valor had reached out to him and had said, hey, would you be interested? We hear you're coming back to Denver. Would you be interested in coaching our team? And so we were in the first round of the playoffs. He called me and said, hey, this is what I'm going to plan on doing. And I've got 2 or 3 options. Got some scouting jobs I'm looking at. Valor's called me to see if they would like to, they're trying to hire a new coach. I said, Valor has hockey? The school's close by my house, 10 minutes away, but I knew they had a good football program. I had no idea they had high school hockey. And so he said, yeah, they really want to get their program going. So I said, okay, well, anyway, long story short, Frank Serratori at the Air Force Academy, when he learned that Killer was coming back to Denver, he reached out to him and said, hey, we want you to become part of our staff. And so Killer accepted the position as their director of hockey. And long story short, we finished the playoffs. We get knocked out the first round. We get knocked out by Chicago in the finals. By the time we get back to Denver, it's early July, and I don't know what I'm going to do. I might take a year sabbatical. We know we're not going back to Tampa. I'd like to get back into college hockey, but it's midsummer. And so I'm hanging around the house, and finally my wife, Bonnie, says, look, you're getting in my way. You got to get out of the house. And she says, hey, I tell you what, she says, didn't Killer call you and say that Valor was trying to hire a coach? Why don't you call the Valor director of athletics and see if he needs some help? If he hasn't already selected a coach, see if he needs some help because a lot of the people in this area. Maybe you can help them select the coach, at least give your 2 cents worth. I said, good idea. Yeah, I'll do that. So I called Jamie Heiner, the director of athletics, and I went down there, and we sat down in the press box of the football stadium and went over the list and talked about his idea and the school's plan, the model they wanted to use to build a hockey program, and all the things that their dreams of what they wanted to do with not only hockey but with athletics at the school. And I remember after about an hour, he said, hey, I'd love to have you come back and we can talk more because I'm learning a lot about hockey. And so I said, sure, I'll come back tomorrow. So we came back, and we sat again for another hour and a half, and he had one of his other assistant ADs. And so they kept talking, and the more I kept asking them about athletics and about the school and about hockey. And not that I was interviewing them, but I wanted to find out, because if there was someone who I knew in the community who they wanted to hire, I wanted to say, hey, yeah, this is a great opportunity for you. But the more we kept talking, the more I became intrigued. I think it was our third meeting. I said, hey, would you guys be interested in someone like me? And that's where, the rest is like history, I guess. And I still wear my Ron Mason garden gloves.
Back to them, huh? The leather gloves.
Yeah.
Love it.
Yeah. So yeah, that's been it.
Well, Ben, I got one more topic, and
Sure.
I don't know how I'm going to phrase the question, but George, as we know, is a Hall of Fame coach, and there's pressure in coaching, pressure to win, pressure in recruiting, pressure to run your program the right way, pressure to be answerable to your institution. But George's dad, longtime doctor, physician in Thunder Bay for 55 years, I think I read. And his brother, Mark, longtime bureaucrat in the Canadian government.
Diplomat. Canadian diplomat. He hates that bureaucrat. No, he was part of the Foreign Service and very accomplished.
Canadian diplomat, accomplished diplomat who would have to take the Clinton administration or the Bush administration or the Iranians to task over nuclear weapons and stuff like that. So wow. I'm just wondering, George, around the Gwozdecky dinner table at times with all these serious issues, doctors, physicians, diplomats, and you're the fun and games guy. How did that work out?
Well, I know what you're getting at. And my dad, it was kind of a running joke, maybe not around our dinner table, but a running joke amongst our friends. Because as you mentioned, Mark, my youngest brother, was with the Foreign Service in Canada for his entire career, just retired. And from a proud older brother, he was really successful in the job he did for the Canadian Foreign Service. He ran embassy. He was an ambassador in Damascus, in Vienna, in Singapore, in Manila. Really well-spoken, dealt with Condoleezza, during the Iraqi war or the Desert Storm, was very involved with the International Atomic Energy Agency. They hired him for a year to help dissipate the information from the investigators to the world media. Really accomplished guy. I'm
Serious stuff.
Yeah, I'm bragging on him because he was prior to his retirement, and really, from what I know, really well liked, very respectful guy, and I always still refer to him as my stupid younger brother, but that's around the dinner table. And then my middle brother, our middle brother, a very successful lawyer and chiropractor, sports chiropractor in Sydney, Australia. Worked with many of the world athletes coming out of Sydney, the surfers and the tennis players, and has gone to world championships in those sports for Australia. And so the joke amongst our friends that around the Gwozdecky dinner table, my dad would say, "Well, Mark, what have you done?" And Mark said, "Well, I helped negotiate peace in the Middle East." And okay, Pete, what have you done? And well, I've been able to heal a number of these top world surfers, and so another world champions now. And well, that's all fine and good, but George's team just beat Duluth in overtime 2-1. So George, tell me about the game. So, Dad was always involved, loved hockey, never played the sport, but loved hockey, and was always involved either as our team physician as kids or, in our junior hockey days, and would be at the rink as much as he could, in addition to his career of being a general physician, a general practitioner. So yeah, it was hockey was in his blood, and he loved coming to Wisconsin to watch us play when I was playing with the Badgers. Loved coming to Denver, especially to watch us play, and Michigan State when I was an assistant. So yeah, his road trips and coming to watch our games, whether I was an assistant coach or head coach, he would be. When satellite dishes became popular and he could watch our games on TV, he was as happy a guy as there ever could be. Now, I always had to deal with him on Sundays because I would always call home on Sundays to see how him and Mom were doing. And sure enough, after the hi, how are you doing? Okay, why did you guys do this on Friday? Why did you decide to do this on Saturday? And you're not being physical enough, or you're not, your turn. I mean, again, he would be our biggest critic, and it would drive me crazy at times. But yeah, he loved his hockey, and he loved his college hockey.
Dan Kelly and Charlie Host.
Exactly right. Yeah, exactly.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, that's a great way to end things, guys, on the family topic, and great stuff, George. Can't thank you enough for taking time to do this, not once, but twice. So thanks so much for that. We appreciate it.
My pleasure. Now, do you really think that someone's going to sit through almost 3 hours of me?
Yeah, people will. You're a popular guy.
Well, you people are whoever you are. Thank you, because I know my wife wouldn't sit through this at all. She would be sitting there with reading her book. She would. But hey, guys, it's been my pleasure. Really, it has been.
Well, awesome. Well, she's lived it all, so she doesn't need to watch it again, right?
That's true. Yeah.
So, Freddie, any last word from you?
No, that's great. It's been fun.
All right. So only coach in the history of the sport, player, assistant, head coach, national champion, 2 at Denver, almost 600 wins in his head coaching career. Thanks to George Gwozdecky for joining us on this edition of No Holding Back. For Fred, I'm Ben. We'll see you next time with an all-new edition.